The security cameras captured everything. A man in torn clothing, moving through the shadows of Atlanta's Symphony Center, somehow slipping past 3 layers of security during one of the most exclusive classical music events of the year. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media, but no one could have predicted how this single moment would change 2 lives forever and spark a movement that would sweep across America. The question everyone would be asking by morning was simple. When faced with the impossible choice between protocol and compassion, what would you do? Before we continue with this incredible story, I want to know, what city are you listening from, and how old are you? Drop it in the comments below, and if this story moves you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because stories like this remind us why music truly has the power to change the world. The André Rieu concert at Atlanta's Symphony Center was proceeding exactly as planned. The orchestra followed their rehearsed repertoire, the audience sat comfortably in their expensive seats, and the security team remained alert to every detail until the moment when an unknown man, clearly out of place in this refined environment, emerged from the side balcony, ignored instructions, walked past security guards, and without any permission climbed onto the stage, creating an uncomfortable situation that left musicians paralyzed, producers alarmed, and hundreds of people wondering if this was part of the show or a real intrusion. While André Rieu, instead of ordering immediate removal, decided to observe something in this man that no one else seemed willing to see. Hours before that concert, nothing indicated the evening would spiral out of control or become a topic of conversation beyond the attending audience. André Rieu's team had arrived early at the concert hall, as always, to review sound, lighting, orchestra positions, and the exact schedule of every musical entrance according to a pattern repeated in presentations throughout America. André spent part of the afternoon talking with musicians, adjusting interpretation details, and keeping the atmosphere light without any sign of tension or rush. Outside, while the audience began to form, a man observed the movement with quiet attention. Ezekiel had been there for hours, leaning against the side of the building, dressed in worn clothing and carrying a small backpack containing everything he owned. He had no ticket and knew he wouldn't get inside, but also didn't seem prepared to leave. For him, hearing the music, even from a distance, was enough to stay in that place. Ezekiel had known those melodies long before he ended up on the streets. At another time in his life, he had attended concerts, learned violin as a young man of 24, and believed music would be his path, until wrong decisions, personal losses, and time pushed him toward a reality from which he could rarely escape. Still, certain compositions awakened an almost automatic attention in him, as if his body responded before his mind. When the doors opened and the audience began taking their seats, Ezekiel was pushed closer to the side entrance, following the sound escaping from the building. Inside, André Rieu positioned himself for the concert's beginning, without suspecting that same evening, a choice outside the script would not only test the organization of the spectacle, but also the way everyone there understood music's role. The tension in the backstage area was palpable, though nobody spoke it aloud. Team members exchanged meaningful glances while performing their tasks. Paisley checked technical aspects for the umpteenth time, her clipboard filled with notes and schedules. She was known for her perfectionism, and any deviation from the plan made her nervous. Colt walked his usual round past security posts. His experience had taught him you could never be too careful at events of this magnitude. There were always people trying to gain access without tickets, fans wanting to get too close, or in rare cases, individuals with less noble intentions. Sage tuned her violin for the last time, her fingers gliding over strings with the familiarity of years of practice. She looked around at her orchestra colleagues, all professionals who had done this hundreds of times, yet there was always that undercurrent of excitement before each concert, the tension before the first note sounded. Blaze ran between the curtains, his headset crackling with constant communication from the technical team. Lights, sound, cameras, everything had to run in perfect synchronization. He had learned to be prepared for every possibility, but what was coming that evening wasn't in his playbook. Outside, the crowd began to swell. People streamed through the main entrance, their voices a mixture of excitement and anticipation. Some were attending an André Rieu concert for the first time, others were loyal fans who followed every performance. All shared the same expectation, an evening full of beauty, emotion, and musical perfection. Ezekiel observed all this from his spot on the side. He saw the elegant clothing of the visitors, heard their laughter and conversations, smelled the scent of perfume and cologne that drifted in with them. It was a world he had once been part of, a world that now seemed unreachably far. But music was different. Music had no boundaries, no dress codes, no entrance fees. Music could travel through walls, float over streets, and reach even someone like him. And that evening, music would do something no one could have predicted. The clock ticked forward, doors closed, lights dimmed. The concert was about to begin, and with it, the events that would make this evening unforgettable. When the concert began, everything followed exactly the expected pattern. The orchestra came into formation, the audience responded with polite applause, and André Rieu took his usual position, confident this would be another presentation led with precision and controlled emotion. The first pieces proceeded without interruptions, and the atmosphere in the concert hall reflected the balance between spectacle and formality that always accompanied his concerts. Outside, Ezekiel approached closer to the side of the building, guided by sound escaping through technical doors. He knew that repertoire and recognized every transition, every calculated pause. At a certain moment, he noticed one of the service entrances was partially open, used by the team for quick circulation between stage and backstage. There was no clear plan, no calmly thought-out decision. He simply followed the sound as he had so often in his life, when music seemed the only thing that still made sense. Inside the building, Colt, head of security, monitored movement along the sides, alert to any behavior outside expectations. The audience was calm, but experience had taught him that one detail was enough to change everything. That's when he saw Ezekiel crossing a boundary that shouldn't be crossed. The worn clothing and uncomfortable posture didn't fit the environment. Colt signaled 2 security staff to approach, convinced the situation would be discreetly resolved before attracting attention. Ezekiel, however, kept walking, ignoring the first instructions, not in defiance, but like someone who no longer automatically responded to external commands. He climbed the few steps leading to the stage, precisely at the moment a piece ended, and the momentary silence ensured his presence was noticed by everyone simultaneously. The reaction was immediate. Some musicians instinctively stepped back, others remained motionless, waiting for instructions. Paisley, the producer, stood up from the technical table and began quickly talking via radio with the team to request immediate intervention. The audience murmured, trying to understand if this was part of the spectacle or if something was wrong. André Rieu, who until then had been observing the orchestra and audience, directed his gaze toward the man now standing several meters from him. There was no aggressiveness, no haste in his movement. Ezekiel remained still, looking around with attention like someone who had arrived at a familiar place after being away for a long time. Colt moved toward the side of the stage, ready to remove the intruder, but hesitated when he noticed André had discreetly raised his hand, signaling to wait. It wasn't a theatrical gesture or an announced decision. It was a silent request for a few seconds where no one should do anything. This brief interval was enough to increase tension. Paisley tried to catch André's attention, pointing out that protocol required immediate removal of any unauthorized person. Some musicians exchanged uncertain glances. The audience, now in complete silence, observed every movement, but then something happened that no one expected. A woman in the audience, sitting in the 4th row, stood up and shouted, "Let him stay!" Her voice broke the silence, like a stone falling into still water. Others looked at her, some surprised, others nodding in agreement. It was as if her cry had released something in the collective psyche of the audience. André turned toward the woman, his face neutral but his eyes curious. In his long career, he had experienced many strange things, but this was different. The audience began participating, not as passive spectators but as active participants in what was happening. Ezekiel still stood at the same point, but now looked not only at the orchestra but also at the audience. His eyes were wide open, his body tense. It seemed as if he only now realized where he was and what he had done. Fear flashed across his face, followed by something that looked like regret. Paisley whispered urgently into her radio. Security personnel began moving, ready to intervene. But André raised his hand again, this time with more emphasis. He didn't want this moment ended by violence or coercion. There was something bigger happening here, something he didn't fully understand yet, but wanted to explore. Sage put down her violin and stepped forward, closer to André. She whispered something in his ear, something only he could hear. André listened, nodded slowly, and then turned back to Ezekiel. The tension in the hall was almost palpable. a collective holding of breath while everyone waited to see what would happen. And then André did something no one had expected. He walked toward Ezekiel, not quickly but thoughtfully, and extended his hand, not to lead him away, not to confront him, but in a gesture that seemed like an invitation. Ezekiel looked at the extended hand, his own hands trembling at his sides. The audience watched in breathless silence. This wasn't scripted performance or planned emotional climax. This was real, raw, human. And in that moment, the concert transformed from a musical event into something much deeper, something everyone present that evening would never forget. André's approach completely changed the dynamics on stage. The gesture asking security to wait still hung in the air, and no one seemed willing to break that interval without a clear order. Ezekiel remained motionless with his hands visible, his gaze alternating between the musicians and the maestro, like someone trying to confirm he was truly at the place he intended. André stopped a few steps away from him. He didn't speak immediately, but observed details that would normally go unnoticed. The way Ezekiel held his shoulders tense, the care not to touch anything around him, and especially how his eyes responded to the instruments, lingering on the nearest violin, as if recognizing something old. This didn't match behavior of someone seeking attention or confusion. Backstage, Paisley insisted via radio that the situation needed resolution before it got out of hand. Colt kept security staff ready, evaluating every possible reaction from the man on stage. The audience began leaning forward in their seats, alert to every word that could explain what was happening. It was André who broke the silence, speaking calmly and audibly only to Ezekiel initially. He asked if he was all right and if he needed help. The simple question seemed to disarm any expectation of confrontation. Ezekiel took a deep breath before responding, as if organizing thoughts required greater effort than climbing onto the stage. He explained in a low, irregular voice that he hadn't intended to interrupt the concert or cause problems. He said he had heard the music from outside and for a moment believed he needed to be there. He made no requests or lengthy justifications, only stated he recognized those melodies and hadn't heard anything like it in a long time. The conversation, though brief, attracted Sage's attention, who observed the scene from several meters away, holding her violin firmly. She noticed André wasn't dealing with an ordinary intruder, but someone who seemed to carry a quiet history connected to music. Other musicians began relaxing their defensive posture, still alert but less tense. But then someone in the audience, an elderly man in the third row, turned and shouted to people behind him, "Quiet, let the maestro work." His voice was authoritarian, almost angry. It created a wave of discomfort through the hall. People began murmuring, some agreeing with the man, others silently condemning him for his lack of compassion. This new element added a layer of public pressure that wasn't there before. It was no longer just a matter between André, his team, and Ezekiel. Now the audience itself had formed two camps, and tension between them added a new dimension to the crisis. Paisley discreetly climbed onto the stage, trying to intervene, pointing out to André that thousands of people were waiting for the concert's continuation, and any delay could generate unpredictable reactions. André listened but didn't respond immediately. He knew every second of that pause increased pressure, but he was also aware that sending Ezekiel away without understanding his presence would end the situation abruptly, leaving something unresolved. The audience began whispering again, divided between curiosity and impatience. Some believed everything was part of an unexpected surprise. Others showed clear discomfort. Yet no one stood up. No one loudly demanded explanation. There was collective expectation that something would be decided at that moment. André turned to Ezekiel and asked if he had any connection to music. The answer came with hesitation, but was clear. Ezekiel said he had played violin years earlier, that he had visited halls like this when life still followed another direction, and hearing that orchestra made him remember a time when he felt part of something meaningful. He didn't go into detail about how he ended up on the streets or what he had lost along the way. This simple story was enough to change the weight of the decision André had to make. He knew allowing Ezekiel's stay on stage contradicted basic rules of safety and production. He also knew removing him at that moment would be the easiest and most defensible option. Yet here was a rare chance to turn an incident into something else. But then, something unexpected happened again. Blaise, the technician who had been standing on the sideline the whole time, suddenly walked forward and whispered something in Paisley's ear. Her face changed immediately from worried to shocked. She looked at André, then at Ezekiel, then back at Blaise, who nodded, confirming what he had just said. What Blaze had discovered in the short time Ezekiel was on stage would change everything. He had contacted entrance security via his headset, who had examined Ezekiel's backpack when he slipped inside. In that backpack, among the few possessions, they had found something, an old photograph of a much younger Ezekiel dressed in formal concert attire, standing next to a violin in front of a banner from a prestigious music festival. This wasn't some random homeless man disrupting a concert. This was once a musician, and not just any musician, but someone who had performed at a high level. The discovery added a completely new layer to what was happening. It wasn't just a story of compassion or humanity. It was a story of loss, of how quickly someone could fall from the stage to the street, and how fragile success truly was. Paisley hesitated. Should she share this information with André? Would it influence his decision? Before she could decide, Sage leaned toward André and whispered, "I think he's telling the truth. Look at how he looks at the instruments. That's not the gaze of a spectator." André looked again at the audience, his decision hanging in the balance. The silence was no longer just tension, but expectation. And what he would do now would not only be operational, but symbolic, determining how that evening would be remembered. André knew every word spoken at that moment would carry more weight than usual. It wasn't just about solving an unforeseen situation, but about publicly taking a position that contradicted expectations, internal rules, and the logic of a spectacle of that magnitude. He took a deep breath before addressing the audience, aware that after what he was about to do, there would be no turning back. He explained simply and directly that this man was not part of the show, and his presence on stage wasn't planned. He didn't try to soften the situation or turn it into something theatrical. He said only that music sometimes crosses unexpected paths, and he found it important to listen before acting. The speech's clarity reduced part of the tension, though it didn't remove the general surprise. Colt remained alert, positioned close enough to intervene if needed. Paisley observed with visible concern, mentally calculating consequences of that decision for production, the concert's image and audience safety. Yet none of them directly interfered. The responsibility now lay entirely in André's hands. He turned to Ezekiel and asked objectively if he felt capable of remaining there calmly while the concert continued. There were no promises or explicit invitations, only a question that set clear boundaries. Ezekiel nodded, showing he understood the moment's seriousness. He didn't try to come closer or touch any instrument. He remained where he was with restrained attention. Sage, observing the scene, noticed something unusual happening, not just on stage, but in the audience's reaction. People showed no hostility. On the contrary, there was growing interest, a collective attempt to understand who this man was and why André Rieu was willing to interrupt the concert for him. Music had in that moment stopped being just performance and become context. André then made an intermediate decision, avoiding extremes. He asked the orchestra to resume with a more subdued piece, without grand crescendos or visual effects, keeping attention divided between sound and Ezekiel's silent presence. It was a way to test the situation without forcing immediate resolution. During the performance, André discreetly observed Ezekiel's behavior. The man kept his eyes fixed on the musicians, following every passage with surprising precision. His movements were minimal, but concentration was clear. There were no signs of instability or intention to interfere. This strengthened André's feeling that his initial reading wasn't wrong. But then, in the middle of the piece, something no one had foreseen happened. A camera crew from a local TV station that had been outside capturing audience opinions had caught wind of what was happening inside. They had found a way to get in and now stood at the back of the hall, cameras rolling, recording the entire incident for live broadcast. This changed everything. What had been an internal matter, a moment between André, his team, and the attending audience, was now public domain. Within minutes, all of Atlanta, maybe all of America, would know what was happening. The pressure on André to make the right decision multiplied exponentially. Paisley saw the cameras and her face went pale. This was a PR nightmare in the making. If André handled this wrong, it wouldn't just affect this evening, but his entire reputation. She rushed to him, this time with more urgency, whispering, "André, we're live. All of America is watching." André's face tightened, but he remained calm. He ended the piece that was playing and turned to the audience again. This time, he spoke not only to people in the hall, but to everyone watching at home. He acknowledged the situation was unusual, that protocol would demand Ezekiel's removal, but he believed there were moments when humanity should stand above procedures. The audience in the hall burst into applause, some standing, but not everyone agreed. A man in the 7th row shouted, "This isn't a charity event. We paid for music." Others hissed at him to be quiet, but his words had struck a nerve. There was now clear division in the audience. Ezekiel, aware of growing controversy he was causing, stepped back as if wanting to remove himself to prevent further problems. But André extended his hand, a silent gesture to stay. It was clear the maestro wanted to make a point, a statement about what he believed music could and should be. Backstage, the crew was divided. Some admired André's courage and compassion. Others worried about the precedent this might set, possible safety risks, legal implications. Colt was in discussion with his team, making plans for every possible outcome. The cameras kept rolling. At home, thousands, maybe millions, sat glued to their TVs, watching this unexpected drama unfold. Social media exploded with opinions, hashtags trending within minutes. Some called André a hero, others a fool. But everyone agreed this was no ordinary concert anymore, and while the world watched and judged, two men stood on a stage in Atlanta, separated by status and circumstances, but connected by something deeper than words, a shared love for music, and the question of whether that love was enough to override all other considerations. Ezekiel took several seconds to respond to André's question, not from indecisiveness, but because he seemed to measure the weight of that unexpected exposure. He knew all eyes were on him, and every word could be interpreted in different ways. When he finally spoke, he said only that he would stay if it wouldn't disturb the concert, and if André truly found it meaningful. The simple answer was enough for André to internally confirm he had made the right decision. He nodded, discreetly indicated to Colt to step back a few paces, and asked the orchestra to reorganize. There was no formal announcement or attempt to turn the moment into something grand. The concert would continue, but now with a presence that completely changed that evening's reading. The choice of the next piece wasn't random. André chose a composition where violin played a central role, not as isolated climax, but as the composition's guiding thread. He observed Ezekiel as he raised the bow, alert to the man's reaction from the first chord. The effect was immediate. Ezekiel almost instinctively adjusted his posture, like someone recognizing an old familiar language. Sage noticed the same movement and exchanged a quick glance with André. There was something in this man that couldn't be explained, only by the moment's emotion. He followed the performance with precision, anticipating rhythm changes and harmonic transitions before they even happened. He wasn't just a moved listener, but someone who deeply understood what was being played. The audience began noticing that silent connection. Without anyone saying anything, it became clear Ezekiel wasn't there by accident. The initial discomfort gave way to concentrated attention, almost collective, as if everyone shared the feeling something rare was happening, even without precisely understanding what. During the performance, André approached Ezekiel somewhat closer, not to put him in the spotlight but to observe his reaction up close. At a certain moment, he made an almost imperceptible gesture, offering Ezekiel the possibility to leave if he felt uncomfortable. Ezekiel shook his head, his eyes fixed on the orchestra, completely absorbed by the music. Backstage, Paisley followed the situation with less rigidity than before. There was still concern about rules and consequences, but it was impossible to ignore that the audience was engaged differently. There were no complaints or signs of impatience. On the contrary, many seemed more attentive than at any other moment of the concert. When the music ended, applause came stronger than in previous moments. It wasn't an explosive reaction but sustained, as if the audience recognized not only the performance, but the implicit meaning of that episode. André waited until silence returned before speaking again. He explained that music, when it truly fulfills its role, doesn't belong only to those on stage or those who bought tickets. He said it sometimes finds people in unexpected situations, and ignoring this would diminish its reach. He asked for no consent or approval, only shared his vision, again taking responsibility for keeping Ezekiel there. Then André made an even more delicate decision. He asked Ezekiel, for everyone to hear, if he had ever played violin professionally. The question didn't sound like invitation or challenge, but acknowledgement. Ezekiel answered that he had played many years earlier, studied and performed in other times, but life had completely removed him from that path. The hall remained in absolute silence after that revelation. The story began gaining clearer contours, and distance between stage and audience seemed ever smaller. André knew the next step would definitively define that evening, not just as an unexpected incident, but as a moment that would be remembered long after that concert hall. And then André did something that surprised even his own orchestra members. He walked to the side of the stage where a reserve violin rested, carefully picked up the instrument, briefly checked the strings condition, and returned to Ezekiel. He extended it without haste, like someone offering something with awareness of that action's weight. The audience collectively held its breath. Would Ezekiel accept it? Could he play? And if he did, what would that mean for everyone watching? Ezekiel stared at the extended violin, his hands trembling at his sides. This wasn't just an instrument. It was a gateway to a past he had tried to bury, a reminder of who he had been before everything collapsed. Tears filled his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. The moment stretched out, each second feeling like eternity. And then, slowly, almost reverently, Ezekiel reached out and accepted the violin. The contact of wood against his hands was like an electric shock, bringing back decades of avoided memories in a single moment. André stepped back, giving Ezekiel space to decide what would happen now. The orchestra waited. The audience waited. The world outside this hall waited. And in that silence, that deep, meaningful silence, something extraordinary happened. Ezekiel's response made clear that evening had already crossed every boundary the production had foreseen. André noticed it was no longer about managing an unforeseen situation, but dealing with a human consequence now exposed to everyone. He knew every decision from that point would be observed, recorded, and discussed. But he also understood that backing down at that moment would negate everything that had already happened. André asked the audience for a few seconds and approached the side of the stage where a reserve violin rested on its stand. There was no prior announcement or detailed explanation. The gesture was simple and direct. He picked up the instrument, quickly checked the strings condition, and turned to Ezekiel, extending it without haste, like someone offering something with awareness of that action's weight. The silence in the hall became absolute. There was no applause or murmuring. The audience seemed to understand this wasn't a moment for immediate reaction. Ezekiel hesitated. He looked at the violin, then at André, and for a moment seemed to consider refusing, not from lack of will, but from fear of not measuring up to what was being offered. André didn't verbally insist. He only held out the instrument and said clearly there was no obligation, that he could just hold it if he wanted or return it without any consequence. The choice had to be Ezekiel's, not the spectacle's. After several seconds, Ezekiel accepted the violin. The way he held it immediately revealed this wasn't foreign to him. He carefully adjusted position, discreetly tested a string, and took a deep breath. André made a brief sign to the orchestra, indicating they would only accompany if Ezekiel felt comfortable playing. The first sound came cautiously, almost like a test. It wasn't perfect or strong, yet it was enough for Sage to recognize intact basic technique. Gradually, Ezekiel gained confidence. Following the melody André suggested. There was no bold improvisation or attempt to impress. It was someone reclaiming something that had been part of him after being away for a long time. The audience watched without exaggerated reaction. Many remained motionless, alert to every note. Others showed restrained emotion, not from virtuosity but from the clear meaning of that moment. The music continued for several minutes, simple and controlled, enough to establish real connection between stage, orchestra, and this man who had arrived without invitation. When the last note sounded, André made a discreet gesture to end. Silence lasted several seconds before applause emerged, this time strong and sustained. It wasn't just artistic reaction, but collective recognition of what had happened there. Ezekiel carefully returned the violin, visibly moved but without seeking any protagonism. André thanked the audience and explained the concert would continue normally. He made no long speeches or tried to turn the episode into a lesson. He stated only that that evening everyone had been reminded music doesn't lose its value when it finds unexpected paths. Then he indicated Ezekiel should be escorted to a safe place, away from excessive exposure. But then, just when everyone thought the moment was over, something no one had foreseen happened. A man in the audience, dressed in an elegant suit, stood up and walked to the aisle. He was a well-known philanthropist in Atlanta, owner of several businesses in the city. He asked to speak, and André, curious, gave him the floor. The man spoke briefly but powerfully. He said he had come that evening for music, but was leaving with something much more valuable, a reminder of what truly matters. He announced he would personally finance a complete scholarship for Ezekiel, including housing, guidance, and everything needed to get him back on track. Moreover, he He offered to do this for any homeless musician in Atlanta who wanted help. The audience burst into standing ovation that lasted for minutes. Tears streamed down faces throughout the hall. This was no longer just a concert. It was a moment of collective humanity, a reminder that society could be more than separate individuals pursuing their own interests. Ezekiel, overwhelmed, could barely speak. André embraced him in a gesture of genuine connection between two musicians, separated by circumstances, but united by art. The cameras captured every moment, and what had begun as potential PR nightmare was transformed into one of the most powerful moments in André's career. After the concert, André spoke again with Ezekiel privately. He offered concrete help, contact with production people, and possibility of guidance so he could reorganize his life if he wished. There were no grand promises, only real and immediate support. That evening, many left the concert hall talking about the incident. Some spoke about music, others about André's compassion, still others about the man who had climbed onto the stage without permission. What no one discussed was the concert's original repertoire. Everyone knew they had experienced something not in the program, but precisely because of that, would be unforgettable. In following days, the story exploded on social media and news channels worldwide. Videos of the moment went viral, some with millions of views. André received thousands of supportive messages, but also some criticism from those who felt he had violated protocols. He read them all but responded only to one, from a young music student who wrote that evening in Atlanta had reminded her why she wanted to be a musician. Ezekiel began his journey toward recovery, supported by the philanthropist and a team of professionals specialized in helping homeless people rebuild their lives. It wouldn't be an easy path, full of challenges and setbacks. But for the first time in years, he had hope, and he had a violin, a gift from André that reminded him of that evening when music had found him again. Months later, when André toured through America, he added a new piece to his repertoire. It was a simple composition, not one of his most famous, but one he always played with eyes closed. Those close enough could hear him whisper before it began, "This is for Ezekiel." And somewhere in Atlanta, in a small apartment no longer cold or unsafe, Ezekiel played the same piece on his violin. His fingers weren't yet back to their old skill level, and maybe they never would be. But that didn't matter because he wasn't playing for perfection or fame. He played because music had reminded him of who he was, and more importantly, who he could still be. The Atlanta concert became legend, a story told and retold, each time with small variations but always with the same core. The moment André Rieu decided humanity was more important than protocol, and when a man with nothing found what he had lost in a violin's strings. For André, it marked a turning point in how he saw his role as artist. It was no longer just about making beautiful music for people who could afford it, but about remembering art has power to transform, heal, and connect, regardless of circumstances. And for everyone present that evening in the hall or watching from home, it remained a reminder that sometimes life's most meaningful moments are those we don't plan, that surprise us, that challenge us to think bigger than our small world of rules and expectations. Years later, when people asked André about his most memorable concert, he never mentioned the biggest venues, most prestigious occasions, or perfect performances. He always mentioned Atlanta, the evening when a homeless man climbed onto his stage, and how that man had reminded him of music's true power. And Ezekiel, he didn't fully recover or gain worldwide fame or great career, but he found something better: stability, dignity, and purpose. He gave violin lessons to children in his neighborhood, shared his story with those willing to listen, and reminded everyone who met him that it's never too late to find what you've lost. The story of that evening in Atlanta became more than just anecdote. It became symbol, reminder that compassion and art can go hand in hand, that rules are important, but humanity is more important. And sometimes the most powerful moments come when we have courage to interrupt our plans and pay attention to unexpected gifts life offers us. The ripple effects of that evening continued to spread across America like waves from a stone thrown into still water. Within weeks, the Atlanta moment, as it came to be known, sparked a nationwide movement that no one could have anticipated. Musicians in cities across the country began incorporating unexpected moments into their concerts. Not staged performances, but genuine openness to spontaneous human connection. The Chicago Symphony started a program called Open Stage Nights, where anyone with musical background, regardless of current circumstances, could audition for a chance to perform alongside professional musicians. In New York, the Philharmonic launched the Second Chance Symphony, specifically for musicians who had fallen on hard times. In Los Angeles, Hollywood musicians began organizing monthly concerts in homeless shelters and recovery centers, not as charity performances, but as collaborative artistic endeavors. The philanthropist who had stood up that night in Atlanta, whose name was revealed to be Harrison Blackwell, found himself at the center of a movement he never intended to start. His initial offer to help homeless musicians in Atlanta expanded when others began reaching out, wanting to contribute. Within 6 months, the Harrison Blackwell Foundation had chapters in 43 states, each dedicated to finding and supporting musicians who had lost their way. But it wasn't just about money. It was about restoring dignity, providing instruments, offering performance opportunities, and most importantly, reminding talented people that their gifts still mattered. Ezekiel became an unlikely symbol of this movement, though he never sought the spotlight. His story was featured in documentaries, news programs, and magazine articles, but he always insisted the focus should be on the music, not on him personally. He established a small music school in a converted warehouse in downtown Atlanta, where he taught children from low-income families alongside adult students who were rebuilding their lives. His teaching style was unique. He understood intimately what it meant to lose everything and find your way back through music. His students didn't just learn technical skills, they learned resilience, hope, and the transformative power of artistic expression. Many of his adult students were veterans dealing with PTSD, former addicts in recovery, people emerging from domestic violence situations, or simply those who had experienced life's harsh, unexpected turns. The warehouse became known as Ezekiel's Place, though he always insisted it belonged to everyone who walked through its doors. Local businesses began donating instruments, music stands, sound equipment. Professional musicians volunteered their time. The Atlanta Symphony Orchestra developed a partnership with the school, with members regularly visiting to provide masterclasses and performance opportunities. What had started as one man's desperate climb onto a stage had become a thriving community centered around music's healing power. André Rieu himself visited Ezekiel's Place several times during his subsequent American tours. Each visit was unannounced, and he would simply show up, violin in hand, ready to play with whoever was there that day. These sessions were never recorded or publicized. They were purely about the joy of making music together. During one such visit, André found himself in a circle with a former jazz musician battling addiction, a classical violinist who had lost her hearing in one ear, a country fiddler whose hands had been damaged in an industrial accident, and a young prodigy whose family couldn't afford professional lessons. As they played together, André realized this was what music was meant to be. Not a commodity to be consumed by those who could afford it, but a living, breathing force that connected human souls across every barrier society could construct. The story of that Atlanta evening was eventually adapted into a documentary called The Unexpected Note, which won several awards and sparked discussions in music schools, concert halls, and community centers across the globe. But perhaps more importantly, it changed how people thought about success, failure, and second chances. The documentary didn't shy away from the harsh realities of homelessness or the complex factors that can lead someone from concert stages to street corners, but it also demonstrated that redemption was possible and that sometimes the most profound changes begin with simple acts of recognition and compassion. 5 years after that night, Atlanta hosted the first International Festival of Second Chances, where musicians from around the world who had overcome significant life challenges performed together. Ezekiel served as the festival's artistic director, though he still insisted on performing only in ensemble pieces, never as a featured soloist. He had learned that the most beautiful music happens when individual talents combine to create something larger than any single person could achieve alone. The festival became an annual tradition, drawing audiences who came not just to hear beautiful music, but to be reminded of human resilience and the power of community. André Rieu was the festival's honorary chair, and every year he closed the final concert with the same simple piece he had written for Ezekiel, a melody that had become known as the Song of Found Voices. As he played those familiar notes each year, he looked out at audiences that included musicians who had been homeless, addicted, injured, forgotten, or written off by society, all of whom had found their way back to music, and through music, back to hope. The evening that had begun with an unplanned interruption to a scheduled concert had evolved into something no one could have imagined, a permanent reminder that the most meaningful moments in life often come not from what we plan, but from our willingness to respond with open hearts when the unexpected knocks at our door. And in concert halls, community centers, and small warehouses across America and beyond, the music continued, not just the notes on written pages, but the deeper symphony of human connection, compassion, and the endless possibility for transformation that exists whenever we choose to listen not just with our ears, but with our souls.